Welcome back to Beyond Well. This is a program for people who want to explore our interior lives and learn more about what it means to be human. First, though, I want to welcome back the whole crew. Jenna Lejeune has returned from Argentina. A few words about Argentina, despite the fact that you want to kiss everyone.
Oh, I just loved Argentina so much. It really was this place that every single individual I met was so warm and so friendly, and I would go back in a heartbeat. It was amazing. And I'm Italian, so I can say this. I'm sorry, Italians. Best ice cream in the entire world.
Ooh.
Better than
Really?
Italy.
Ooh.
Better than Italy. Yep. So go to Argentina. It's amazing.
Brian Goff, so good to see you again.
Thank you very much.
You
Good to see
moved
you.
this weekend.
I started to pack this weekend.
Oh,
yeah.
Are you doing the Maria Ondo? Who is the
Kondo.
organizing Kondo?
Kondo.
You were
I already
already
did
her.
It. Yeah, I already did it.
Wow.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Do you feel clean, focused, and joyful?
No, but there is no.
It sounds like I need to move to Portland.
Of all the emotions you're feeling, Brian, clean and joyful are not two of the most prominent ones, right?
Well, they're in the mix. I would say they're in the mix, but it's like an onion when you move, right? There's a lot of stuff.
One of my friends
going
said, you can probably see Maria Kondo's recycling pile from space.
I heard that like
the
the
people that
average family of something like 3 that she works with, and I don't think these are hoarders, after she sorts through their stuff and decides what brings them joy, they end up having 70 bags, garbage bags worth of stuff to just give away, throw away, whatever. Yeah, it's crazy.
I had that many bags in my divorce, not because it
God.
brought me joy to get rid of them, but just because
There's
you have
stuff
to
and
at
you
some
gotta
point,
figure-
right?
And I'm going from something bigger to something smaller, so I've got to
Totally.
figure out.
Yeah,
Well,
we
it's
moved
good to see you
to
again.
we moved to a tiny house in the last year, and so in over the course of about a year and a half before moving in, we probably got rid of about 85% of our stuff, and then we move into the tiny house. And I still keep bringing stuff to the Goodwill. It's you can just keep getting
Well, your
rid
tiny
of
house
more
is
and more stuff.
beautiful, but I have to
Thank you.
imagine there's room for a couple pair of socks, scissors, and be hey, we need some tape. Well, we're going to have to get a storage unit for that.
And I want to welcome, thanks for coming up from Seattle, Sarah Townsend. I've read your memoir over the weekend, and I was gobsmacked by the beauty of the sentences, what you went through, and how you formed it in this framework of poetry and really deep thought and exploration. The topic, of course, is your postpartum psychosis.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you for writing it and for joining us.
It's very moving to me that you liked it.
Yeah, it's gorgeous. One of the things about this show that I really like is that we explore the things that I think we explore the things the way they are rather than the way people want them to be. Yes. And I think with pregnancy and delivery in particular, there is this way in which women are really brain controlled to believe it's going to be so beautiful and you're going to look like Kim Kardashian when your child is born. You'll just have everything together and the child will bring you so much comfort and joy. And I don't think that that's the experience for a heck of a lot of women, but we don't talk about it very often.
It's true. And it's amazing that we've known for quite a while now and we still don't talk about it very often.
Yeah.
One thing that was striking to me in writing this is that it's now 20 years in hindsight.
Yeah.
And I think it's not a coincidence that it dovetails with launching my daughter to college. And I think in a way that I couldn't look away.
Right.
But this very much feels like our book.
Yeah.
And that there's beauty in the birth that we had, despite there having been complications.
I think it's brilliant how you allow your daughter, even in the book, to have these reflections of you, of what you went through as a young woman now, to be looking back on this really profound experience. But it is about postpartum psychosis. And I think if anybody wants to think about a time in your life you don't want to get psychotic, it's right after you deliver a child. Talk a little bit about the experience of what led up to that time and truly kind of the break, if you would.
Well, I was already a practicing psychotherapist, and so it very much caught me by surprise. I think that's probably true for most women. And I suppose it was a classic presentation in that immediately after I gave birth, I couldn't sleep. So that was, in fact, the presentation. And we could explain that in a lot of different ways. A psychiatrist told me that my brain had a seizure with the cutting of the umbilical cord. And that may be a component. Metaphorically, that's clearly the moment of separation from my infant. And one thing that we know now is that postpartum psychosis is most often associated with bipolar disorder, and that link is often missed. And so there was a lot that was not known in terms of what was happening for me. The best thing I could do was to say that I couldn't sleep. And when I said that, I was told that eating was more important, or that sleeping was more important than eating. And of course, that raised my anxiety further.
Around eating and sleeping, right? Yeah. Yes. Yeah, it does all of it. You say in one thing that your doula had prepared you for childbirth and had talked about the possibility of postpartum depression and psychosis, but you, like so many other women, just dismiss it as no, because I'll be making my nursery perfect in some way,
yes, right? And this wasn't just any doula. This was the parent educator, Penny Simkin, who is the founder of the doula movement in the United States and internationally. And what a brave woman to routinely stand up in front of her class of students and say, by the way, this happened to me. And I did dismiss it, but she was also the first one that we called right away to say, we're really unclear what's happening here.
Right.
You know, despite living in a very progressive birthing community and having sort of everything going for me in a way.
Yeah. You say it may have been that there was some sign previous that you were getting into trouble, disorganization, incessantly talking, the belief that I was having a really good idea. I think that's such a fabulous line. I mean, how many people have I talked to when right before they crash, they're like, you must invest, Sheila, right?
Yes. My ideas were brilliant.
Right, so that there was some quickening or something like that before the big crash, right?
No, I would say that I still followed this period of not being able to sleep.
Oh, okay.
And that the sleep deprivation really exacerbated all of that.
Yeah.
If there was a precursor that I could identify now, I would say that during my pregnancy, I had a lot of anxiety, which is also to be expected.
Right.
I was warned about a potential cord death, and that was something that I really had trouble letting go of.
Yeah.
And I just came to have lots of fears about how my daughter could inadvertently be harmed in some way without intent.
Yeah, right. When you recognized how much trouble you were in, or you actually didn't recognize it, this is probably looking back on your psychosis, you say, how is it that we hold ourselves together in the face of impossible losses, when our skin splits open and bleeds like a child's hands and knees landing on a gravel driveway? It's tempting to go numb for a time. It's inevitable. The hour of lead, Emily Dickinson calls it, the grace period between the injury and the pain. what was the grace period? What was the hour of lead for you?
As I hear you read that now, in this moment, I think of it more retrospectively, because I think for me that I really had the Mack truck of illnesses. This wasn't a slow, a kind of a gradual, low-level depression. It was just postpartum psychosis is a psychiatric emergency. It's just no amount of breathing is going to take it away.
Right. Yeah.
So I think that the healing for me was not as much about the psychosis, although that was true. I needed to be brought back, but more like post-traumatic stress.
Uh-huh.
And so I think the kind of numb is just not being able to fully take in what it is that's happened, and then eventually the tremendous grief about the loss of time. And I think for me, and if I were to say that there was a political agenda, it's that I'm really interested in finding ways for treatment for women that does not separate them from their infants. And that would have a tremendous impact on a whole nother generation of babies.
That's right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was so struck in your memoir. You had some line, I won't be quoting it as eloquently as it's written, but it was something about like the most painful part wasn't the madness, it was the loss that you had. And I was so struck by that about, isn't that true? That, it isn't the actual kind of, psychosis or the sound in your brain that is the most painful. It's all of the things that going through that you lost. You lost this maybe time with your infant, and maybe lost a dream that you had about like how beautiful and magical that time would be. I mean, I don't know all of the losses.
Well, it does go back to Sheila's idea that we that we expect that it will all
of course
be beautiful.
Yes.
And I have a certain degree of perfectionism that went well with that view. But I'll tell you that it was a wanted pregnancy, and it was a beautiful birth, despite it having traumatic elements. And when Sophie arrived, there was all that initial connection and breastfeeding. So it looked as if it was going on a healthy trajectory. And one thing that I'm most grateful for is that I didn't personally have the experience of detachment from my baby.
Yes.
In fact, she was one of the few people who could bring me back into myself. I felt some grief this weekend in having read a recent article about a woman who wanted to be the perfect mother and landed in a psychiatric ward. And there was so much overlap, despite how much I thought about this subject, that it actually brought me up short. And what I had heard most in that story was the impact of the separation of the couple and of the mom and the baby. And I said to my husband, Roger, that I'm surprised after all these years, it's very activating for me. It's generating a lot of feeling. And then he said, well, actually, that isn't what happened to you. Your baby did get to come. And so
I thought that was one of the most beautiful images that I've ever read, really, was the idea of this cold, sterile psychiatric center and you, your husband, and your infant lying on the floor together. And I was just, it shook me because I was just thinking, even in these awful places, healing can occur. And it's not because of the medicine oftentimes, it's because of this, the power of human touch and knowing that there's someone we need to love and that they're going to love us back.
Yes, I think that's entirely, I think that is the most therapeutic element, and it's something that I talk about as containment in my book.
Yeah.
But not only was it a linoleum floor, but it was a linoleum floor in a padded room.
Yeah.
And so to bring the love of a relationship into that space, keeping in mind that he was a first-time dad with a baby at home and really
Scary
also not
and
knowing how to
confusing.
cope.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But for all the ways in which my experience did not meet what I would want for an ideal mother-infant hospital, they did bend the rules in whatever way was possible to allow my husband to come to me at night so that I could go to sleep and to allow him to transport my daughter. And so I'm grateful.
Yeah.
for
Those were the themes that pushed through for me. As unique as your experience was, and as you described it like a Mack truck with the psychosis, universal themes of attachment and connection and love, and then loss or fear of loss. Those things feel like they're the kinds of themes that so many of our listeners can relate to, even if they can't relate to the particulars of what was threatening those things or what was healed by those things.
Absolutely. And I think it's not an accident that themes of loss just ripple through my book. You know, it's as if I made a tour of all the losses because, as you know, they're cumulative and interrelated. And I think it's in part why it's not in a linear form, because somehow I was trying to describe how all of these individual moments are mutually influential.
Oh yeah, and you know, your journey back through the memories of your father and your family of origin, where you have this dad who is leaving again for this music career and another mistress and another, you know, grand adventure, and then obviously he's diagnosed with some sort of bipolar or schizophrenia or something. So then there's this specter of illness that is generational as well.
Yes, it's certainly intergenerational, and in my family it wasn't spoken about. So my father, one element of writing this book was how much I adored this man who had mental illness, and unfortunately it wasn't treated and not as much was known about it. It was really stigmatized and also associated with creativity. So what made him so compelling and offbeat sometimes could fold into something that looked more like mania or depression. And because I was his only child and ultimately my parents divorced, I spent a lot of time in his company and having to sort out how much on guard I needed to be.
For your own safety, or because you were never clear that he was stable?
Both, I would say. I would say that clear that he knew how to parent. I knew that he loved me, which is different.
Yeah. Oh, boy, do I understand that one. I wanted, Jenna, because you deal with women who come in with a lot of different body issues, does postpartum show up as also a body trauma, that somehow women think that the body has betrayed them in this, or do they understand? Like, because I'm always thinking about when you're preparing for a child, there's this huge pressure, like, are you eating the right thing? Are you drinking the right thing? Are you exercising enough? Are you sleeping properly? You're this container for what is supposed to be perfect, right?
Right.
And when it isn't perfect, do they blame their bodies, their own sense of self, and how they operated during that period?
That's an interesting question. I haven't heard, at least the people that I serve, talk about it in that way. It's not that I'm sure there are people who have that experience, but I think sort of more generally, there definitely is this blaming aspect. I don't hear people talk about it quite so much as my body failed me, because that requires some sense of ability to separate the self from the body, which is a very difficult thing for most of us to be able to do. But some sense of, I didn't do it right. I was weak in some way, mentally, physically, something like I did something wrong to cause this. And so I think that that's a huge part of the struggle. And then added to what you were saying earlier, that you are appreciative that you still got to have a sense of attachment with your child. I so appreciate you bringing that up, because I do think that that is one of the things as a therapist that I hear from people who have just recently had children with such tremendous shame, that sometimes they don't feel that sense of attachment to their infant. And that's never, ever talked about.
Wow.
Except in the privacy of my office, where I think, sure, I've heard that, 10,000 times. But there's such shame, because the thought is you're always supposed to feel this profound sense of attachment. And so when postpartum, whatever flavor of suffering it is, depression or psychosis, when that also results in a lack of a feeling of attachment to your infant, then there's this like huge shame on top of that.
I can only imagine.
I love the way that you're describing that. It's interesting to me that there are so many expectations of what the pregnancy is supposed to be like, and then what the delivery is supposed to be like, and then what it's like to be a mom. And not only expectations about health and taking the right vitamins and having the right nutrition and being at the right weight and how quickly you get back into shape or whatever that means, but also all the expectations around, as you were saying, Jenna, how I'm supposed to feel about this, the bond that I'm supposed to have, the undying, like, this is a huge gift straight from heaven and that's all it is kind of message.
Right.
I mean, you all were asking me what it's like to pack, and I realized packing and having a baby are I mean, they're right next to each other, of course. But, the question was like, is this amazing or is this great? And it's like, well, I mean, some of that stuff's in there, but I feel like our emotional landscape is so layered and varied that so oftentimes, even if we can't name it and suss it out, it's combinations of emotions that don't seem like they ought to be able to go together. Like, this is a huge gift and what the hell has happened to my life? Right next to each other.
Well, and I felt particularly alone at night, because that's when your support system all needs to restore themselves. And then there you are, still needing to respond to your infant's needs. Of course, there might be a partner who's trying to share some of those elements, but to bring back in the idea of body, I think for me, the idea of losing the option for breastfeeding was particularly, was a tremendous loss, and did fall into the category of ways in which I evaluated my mothering. And so I also think on top of that, then we just carry the layers of this experience in our body. So from here on out, I would say that most of my experience has been coming into contact with all that's living in my body as the memory, the residue of this experience.
People don't often actually describe psychosis, and I think because you have such a masterful quality with language, I'd like you to just talk a little bit about what it was like to actually break from reality.
Well, of course, you don't know that it's happening exactly, and I don't know that I could point to a particular moment. But I do know that suddenly the world felt very amplified, which is akin to what happens to a woman normally in a pregnancy, where sounds are accentuated, smells. But everything seemed to have a double meaning, lots of serendipity with... I think I felt that the world was speaking to me in ways that others couldn't see. And also that it wasn't clear to me where my body began and ended. So it was a very diffuse experience. At the same time, I will say that it's not a constant state, that there are moments when you sort of dial back into yourself and can have a little bit of perspective, which I think can make your family hopeful, and yet was not a long-term, wasn't something that I could retain for the long term. And I couldn't stop talking. So with very, not only incessant speech, but very intensified.
And pressured.
So it's very difficult to be around. And in fact, I think that sometimes hospitalization is needed in order to preserve relationships. Because, as you say, Brian, it's not really workable. It's not really functional.
When you describe the world, you picking up messages in the world that other people aren't able to pick up, was the experience as if you had this heightened ability to see things that other people can't see, or was it more the agency was in the agency was outside of you giving you those?
I didn't hear voices that were commanding kinds of voices in the sense where that would be an external, presumptively telling me what to do. What I felt was that I could read the universe, for lack of a better word, with more clarity than others. So a small example is that we went to a PCC grocery store to get some edamame. That was on the list. And we were trying to decide what aisle it was located in. And just at that moment, a woman rounded the corner with a cart, and all she had in it was edamame. And so for me, it just had to be meaningful. So that's a tiny example. On the flip side, I do think that you have heightened attunement when you're least well. It's actually not a complete fantasy that you can intuit with profound accuracy in a way.
I'm really wanting to get to this. Why did they put you in a psychiatric ward?
I think that ultimately it does hint at a certain kind of psychological gift. And in my notes that I wrote while I was hospitalized, I referred quite often to ESP. It was sort of the one label that I could give it. And later, when I went to see a psychologist in British Columbia who also practices in a very broad sense, she said this was a birth as an initiation rite, that in a way my sensory system had been inverted so that I could perceive, I mean, maybe we could say with the rawness of a poet, right, that I was, but that degree of exposure is in a way intolerable without having some edges, without knowing, without having your feet still on the ground.
You guys, I want to talk a little bit about this. Your type of therapy you do is very much grounded in a different belief system than Jenna and Brian, who are both behavioral therapists. So how would you both look at, how would you frame the psychoses, and then how would you frame the repair of the psychoses? I want to compare and contrast just for people's likability. If they're ever thinking, I want to get this kind of therapy, here's the difference in how it might be viewed and some of the ideas in which you might share with people.
The commonality, I think, is so much more present than the differences. You probably have a different language of talking about than I do. But the thing that you said in the interview that I thought was just so important was it's this connection between mother and infant, or parent and infant, that is what is most precious. That's what needs to get preserved. And however we can, like if medication helps make that reconnection happen faster, that's most important. If there are other interventions, that's great. But I really, really think, I'm a behaviorist, but there is nothing that is more important to humans, I think, than connection. We are this ultra social species who treat connection when that is severed, we treat it as if it is a death, because from my perspective, evolutionarily, it was death. When you got kicked out of the tribe, you literally died. And so we are like biologically programmed to have these attachment needs and these connection needs. And when they get threatened, we respond as if it is a threat to our life. And, so I just think that is
And we were saying that we knew about the differences in theoretical orientation, but through your memoir and in preps for the conversation, we really thought this is going to be a non-starter as far as conflict.
Because you're so good at experience.
Well, I think in practical terms that we all have to begin with a situation that we're describing in an everyday functional manner.
Yeah.
But that to the point of human connection, what I have found to be most helpful is to provide a similar kind of containment for the mother that the mother would provide for the infant.
Yes.
And in fact, that it is typical of childbirth that a mother is split apart, literally, and needs to be held together. So how we do
It's
that
beautiful.
Yeah.
I've also just wondered, we allow in our society for fathers to come to the infant on their own time. We don't demand this immediate bonding. We don't, I've heard so many dads say like it's their thing, and it's only when the child is a little more interactive or sturdier that they actually begin to bond. So why is it that it's almost like if that's not happening for women, then there's this added extra pressure which says, oh my God, I'm depressed and I'm not bonding and I'm a failure. Like, isn't it part going back to the expectations that this is supposed to happen? And so if it's not happening to you, something's really wrong?
I think mothers search for every possible piece of evidence for how they are not mothering well.
Right?
And that delayed attachment is one of the many presentations that are possible.
Yeah.
And even that language sounds pejorative, but I think is probably part of a typical spectrum.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think the gap between what you think you're supposed to be like or what you expect the experience to be and what it actually is or how you actually are behaving is, we've been talking most about how that impacts moms, but I think that's true across gender.
Absolutely.
As a dad who maybe bonds differently, some fathers are going to feel like they want to bond in a particularly close, intimate way, but that's not really like being a guy. Or they have the opposite, that I'm supposed to show up in a particular way and I'm supposed to figure out how I could possibly figure out how to nurse this child as well, et cetera, et cetera. I was a stay-at-home dad for a couple of years, and when my children are adopted, and I had them when they turned 5, 3, and 1 for 2.5 years. I stepped out of practice. And a lot of issues having to do with identity and what this meant to me and the loss of the things I was used to doing and how I wasn't really in a community of fellow parents because I was the token guy that was sort of curious, but
Isolated.
don't get too close.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And then you get together with your buddies and they're talking about work and you're talking about potty training and sandwiches and play dates. And it's just, I think universally, this isn't supposed to be me saying like, well, men too, but I think that this issue of the gap between what we expect it to be like or what we think it's supposed to be and where we are creates all kinds of issues in terms of at least what our minds tell us. Cross gender and across circumstance. This just happens to be a particularly vivid and potent experience for a particular gender.
It's so beautiful that you say it that way. I love how you talk about the kind of distortion of what your kind of tribe is supposed to be at any one time, right?
Yeah.
And I had this very profound experience when I was a new mother. I had to go back to work quite soon, 3 months. And so I wasn't really of the go to the park and have tea and everybody's lounging around under trees tribe. I definitely wasn't ready to be back at work tribe. And so I was kind of wandering in between these worlds of like, I needed, as you described so beautifully, a container for who was I and what the hell was I doing? I didn't belong to either place.
But that goes back to this issue we were talking about earlier about connection. We have such this desire to be a part of a connection, a tribe, to have a sense of like, you get me and I get you. And whether that's, Brian, your experience as a dad hanging out with all of the stay-at-home moms and feeling like, oh, I'm not quite exactly like in this tribe. Yeah. Or Sheila, your experience or my experience of somebody who's never had children. And then what is that like when everybody around me
you get to be the vacation tribe, baby.
Yeah. Well, and actually that's sort of interesting. Like that. Yeah, that happens all of the time, right?
I'll
like
bet.
people say all the time, oh, it's so wonderful how much freedom and blah, blah, blah. And like, and I don't get to have the kid cuddling up with me on Sunday morning.
That whole lucky one.
Right.
It goes back to what we were saying of just all the various layers.
All the various ways.
Yes.
Yeah.
And actually the other thing.
Exactly, Brian.
They live side by side.
It's both.
Right.
And I talk to clients about this all the time, about this sense of it's both and.
Yes.
And I say, what are the great things about being here in
Yes.
my office? And of course, they think they're supposed to say things like,
you're so
I have
nice.
really good insight.
Yeah.
And I'm like, no, more basic. Like I have comfortable chairs. I give you free tea. Things like that. And they're like, oh, okay, right.
Yeah.
And then I say, what are the bad things about being here? And they say, well, the traffic, and it's a little tricky to find parking for visitors. And I thought maybe I'll get towed if I park in the permit spot and blah, blah, blah. And I said, okay, so understand that no matter how bad the traffic is here, if it's worse, the chairs aren't less comfortable.
Yeah.
Right? And it's like,
That's really
right?
good.
Yeah.
And it's
I
like,
think I'm going to come see you.
right.
Right.
And if you decide to park in the permit spot and might get towed, I'm not like, well, they won't tow you as far because the tea is really good. Like that stuff just doesn't make sense, right?
Yeah.
All the good and all the bad, the black and the white don't make gray.
Yes.
They make black and white. And the black
Yes.
doesn't make the white any less white. And the white doesn't make the black any less black. Our experiences, varied as they are, don't really mingle into something we can put a new label on.
Yeah.
They just sort of sit there side by side. And it's like, yep, that's right. And the other thing,
And
that's
we-
also right.
And we have this idea of, if we choose correctly, then we'll get mostly the white and out without the black. And I hear like when people come to my practice and are in kind of that place of should I have a kid or should I not have a child or should I get married or not married, as if they're weighing this pros and cons list of, well, if I make the right choice, then I'm going to have mostly white. And like, I'm here to tell you, I have chosen sort of the path less traveled for most of the choices in my life. And it's black and it's white.
And it's white.
But it's my choice. It's
And
just
it's
kind of,
okay.
and it's fine.
And the relative, what we would call them maybe downsides, don't really go away when somebody goes, "Oh, but come on, Argentina."
Right, exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
Or when I feel sort of disconnected and I'm feeling like I'm getting dumber.
Yeah.
And I stress about things like whether my youngest pooped in his pants or not. And somebody says, well, come on, like your boss isn't yelling at you. And
Right.
you don't have to worry
Right.
about, well, you get to take a nap in the middle of the day or whatever.
Exactly.
As if that ever happened.
I think the tension that we sit in with these decisions is just inherent in the human condition.
Yes, it
Right?
is.
And I have had to come to see that with every choice, there's loss. There's what you're doing and there's what you're
Amen,
not.
Sarah.
doing.
Yes. Oh,
beautiful.
yes.
I also will just dial back quickly because you mentioned the dad postpartum and the adoptive parent.
Yes.
And just that they also have these perinatal experiences.
Yeah.
Thank you
So
for
it's
bringing
not
that
just
in.
moms.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I
That's
do think
beautiful.
that is really important. I was hoping we could talk about that too. This does get focused primarily on women who have biological children, and it does happen with men. And I think it's probably talked about less with men, and it does happen with adoptive parents as well. And it's probably talked about less with that too. So I so appreciate you bringing in all different forms of parenting and how any huge life change like that is going to rock your world. But we live in a world, I think, that sees the person who does their taxes every day as, oh, they're the healthy ones. They're the like normal ones. Even if they're never able to see the beauty or serendipity or the things that the poet or the person who's, having these unusual or not typical experiences feels. And what if we just sort of saw human beings as, how could we be more flexible? How could we have all range of experience?
Yeats said that Newton destroyed the beauty of the rainbow by reducing it to its prismatic colors.
Oh my God,
like
how
that.
beautiful. Wow.
That's really
I
beautiful.
think it's
Brian.
important to remember that I couldn't distinguish between reality and fantasy.
Yeah.
So
Right.
when I'm brought back to myself in a grounded form, then I might be able to learn when to pick and choose those
Exactly.
options.
Yes.
Great point.
Yes.
Really great point.
I think
Exactly.
Yeah, if you could notice, right? If you could notice when an experience shows up that this is my psychosis, then you engage with that thought or that experience a little bit differently than if it is sort of indiscriminately mingled with and masquerading as your non-psychotic experiences. Is that fair to say?
I think it is, because I think what we're grasping at here is the benefit of heightened attunement. That's an exceptional quality that we would want to grow in everyone, and particularly in a parent. But to not be able to organize your thinking in a way that can put you in a position such that you're choosing when to use that skill.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And so this is
Exactly.
really beyond your control.
Absolutely.
And I think that's the hardest part about it, because it can be very disturbing for those around you.
Yeah.
And it's involuntary.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
And we know that some of the kind of best evidence for at least non-pharmacological interventions for psychosis are those interventions that they don't get rid of the hallucinations or delusions. They help teach people how to distinguish, oh, that's my thought, that's this psychotic thought or this thought, and then be able to choose, is that workable to, sort of follow whatever it is saying. So I love what you just said there. It isn't the actual experience itself that is problematic. It's the inability to sort of choose or respond to it in a way that would be most workable for you.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's funny because I was going through the book looking at the techniques that you talked about, that you didn't name them as techniques, but one thing that you said that I thought sounded very much like a behavioral technique is thought stopping. I learned this technique. That's enough for today. I'm going to think about you again tomorrow. If we could come away with one tool for this thing today, it would be like everybody needs to learn things, right? But you developed many, many techniques like that to consistently ground yourself. So have you had experiences since the postpartum that felt like, oh my God, I'm drifting just a little bit too close to where I was before then? I need to pull it back again. I need to ground myself more. I need to quiet things down.
Yes, and it surprises me that that could be true 20 years after the fact. And that's why I really liken it to post-traumatic stress. Because what's been helpful for me is to realize, no, actually, I'm having a sensation that reminds me of what was happening, but is not actually a repetition of the illness. So then I'm really needing to confront my extreme fear about never wanting that to happen to me again. So I've had to white knuckle it out a few times, but in a way I've really been spared, I have to tell you. And that's a bit of a luck of the draw, because I have known people in my life that haven't been restored to quite the same place. It's not a given. And oftentimes it has to do with how many previous episodes there have been and how often you go up and down. So mine was confusing in a way because it was a single experience of a manic episode with no prior history and no subsequent symptoms.
Wow.
So it was a challenging task for me to go back and try to make sense of that, and also to hang on to the idea of, was that actually me?
Mm-hmm.
Did that really happen?
Mm.
And how do I account for it exactly?
Your book doesn't talk about this, but recently the FDA said they're just clearing a medication for postpartum psychosis, for postpartum depression. How would that particular drug act any differently than any other SSRI that's out on the market?
I think medications are a really complicated topic.
Yeah.
And what I would say is that when I received antidepressants for what was mania, I initially looked better, but ultimately they're contraindicated and it exacerbated the symptoms. Now, I'm not saying that my illness might not have had the same course, but it definitely aggravated the illness and it lengthened the time during which I could not sleep. And I had to wait for those medicines to leave my system. At the same time, once I did receive an accurate diagnosis, medications brought me back. So I don't have a definitive thing to say other than I think accurate diagnosis is really important.
Yeah.
Not to assume that unipolar depression is a given.
Yeah.
To try to look for some history or other indications of a bipolar disorder, but specifically about that kind of infusion that was described, this medication that is now available. I think it's quite expensive.
Yeah.
That would not have helped me in particular because it wasn't directed for mania. And I don't know how, it seems to be in its very initial phases. So it may be more arduous now than it could potentially be in the future. So I don't have a direct opinion about it other than to say it is encouraging that we're looking at treatments specifically for what I would now call perinatal mood and anxiety disorders, because we know these are a continuum and they're often starting in pregnancy.
Right.
And that the most important part that I understood from reading is that the intention was to restore the mother-infant relationship as quickly as possible. And I do believe that will lead to the most impactful outcomes.
Yeah. You say that there's a woman, Michelle Overmond, who is really advocating for crimes that are committed during a postpartum psychosis, as that the person should not be held legally responsible. It's the same idea that we have in the court system when somebody is declared insane. I'm so struck by what we know in our hearts is right and the reality out there, which is there's going to be very little support for that.
My initial response is that we're failing women before they're put in the position to have such a tragic event occur.
Right.
And for me, I think I kept being pulled to those stories because it was unfathomable to me that a woman could have an illness that she did not choose, that the illness would lead her to do acts that she would never execute in any other situation, and then that she would be punished. So I'm not saying that these are not hugely concerning potential events, but that we need to do more upfront. Prevention is really what people seem to be moving toward.
Yeah.
I guess if I could add to that, I might extend that even beyond women who are experiencing psychosis or postpartum and kill their infants, but probably most people who are committing crimes or I mean, we have so radically failed people who are suffering psychologically in our country. It's shocking to me, as if the other person, the person who goes out and commits a school shooting, or the person who any number of other crimes, as if they're somehow choosing that. We've failed. If that's the outcome for anybody, we have very clearly failed them way earlier in the line. And I am not saying that there shouldn't then also be consequences for that behavior. Certainly not saying that. But I am saying, I think, especially as a psychologist myself, we have failed people to be able to help them deal with the suffering that they are struggling with, so that they end up that this is the outcome. I just think that's tragic.
Yeah. In all of my wisdom as a criminal justice expert,
well, mine too, Brian.
Right?
Clearly.
The thing that I most feel when I think about that is how tragic the situation is already.
Right.
It just breaks my heart that that somebody would find themselves having done this so opposite what they would otherwise do, and the enormity of that loss, and then to add to it a punishment that doesn't erase the loss or the pain or the suffering. It doesn't set anything right. To me, it seems like tragedy on tragedy.
Yeah, we have this way of punishing people who are suffering rather than, or maybe even in addition to, if consequences have to happen, also understanding the context that would create that. We do this thing of, they're the monsters, they're the, we would never do that, versus asking the question, oh, wow, what did produce this? That, they're cut of the same cloth I am. And there's this really, really wonderful book. I think the author's last name is Browning. It's called Ordinary Men. And it's this examination of ordinary citizens in Germany during the Holocaust, and how we love to think, oh, we would never commit the atrocities that were committed. And I do think, as mental health professionals, it is on us to be able to ask those questions of wait, what leads to this? If it isn't just you're broken and you're damaged.
That's such a beautiful place to end. Incredible. I don't know when this is coming out, but I am telling everyone that I can to read this. Setting the Wire, a memoir of postpartum psychosis, exploring motherhood and mental illness. Sarah Townsend, thank you so much for coming down and joining us today.
Thank you for having me. And I'll just say in ending that the opportunity to make art from this experience has been one of the most important acts of my life. So I'm grateful to have readers.
It's beautiful art.
I would add, also just buy the book. Read it, but purchasing the book, it is a stunning book. It is absolutely beautiful. I've never seen a book that has such this lovely presentation to it. It's like a work of art.
You will love the book to read,
yes,
and you will love the book just to have it in your hands and look at.
Yes.
Absolutely.
It's available now at sarahtownzendwriter.com.
Okay,
it's from the Lettered Streets Press.
Wonderful.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Thank you so much for downloading and talking to your friends about Beyond Well. This is a community of people that is growing pretty rapidly, and we are so happy to see so many of our friends listening from Australia. If you ever want to get in touch, you can find us at beyondwellwithsheilahamilton.com. Be well.